intuition, I should say, and that is that if Israel can rely on even cheaper labor from abroad due to the kind of international flows of immigration, and then just push out the Palestinians and push out or kill the Palestinians, take all of their land, because I'm sure we've already seen that they're designing projects for Gaza and already, they've got the beach resorts already designed for what's going to go in after they just bulldoze the entire place. And so I imagine that whatever those backroom conversations are, they have to do with a calculus concerning the cheapness of the labor pools and also the ways in which colonialism and the specific forms of racism that it takes on usually tends to target the population whose land is being taken away. And so in that regard, I do think that the situation at least is a little bit different than the South African situation. Maybe the last thing that I would say on this, and this is a little bit of a different comment, but it relates to the earlier question by Jonathan, and that is that this has often been a case that capitalist ruling class and bourgeois states have faced. That is that there's so many forces rising up from below, and how do they manage insurgencies? And in the case of the United States, if you look at what was going on in the 1960s, for instance, within the more revolutionary elements of the Black liberation struggle, that was a similar problem. Either we just crush these people and we keep segregation, and we're going to discredit ourselves internationally and nationally for that matter, and it's just going to be a bloodbath. It already was a bloodbath to some extent, but it'd be even worse. Then what do we do? And what the US decided to do in that case, I think, is quite revealing, and that is that they really, legally, they said, okay, well, everybody has the same rights, but we know that de facto that's not at all the case. But then they also propped up a Black professional managerial class. And the Ford Foundation and the corporatocracy was involved in this very explicitly, and they knew exactly what they were doing. They were basically honeypotting people who were leaders from the Black community who could play the role of being kind of leading reformists who were pro-corporate, amenable to Black capitalism and things like this. And then they could create what's now called a kind of Black misleadership class. And so you desegregate in principle, and then you only allow a few up so that then you can point to them in a form of tokenism and say, look, these people succeeded. And so it's a different form of segregation. It's not the exact same as apartheid, but structurally and at the level of economics, it still basically operates in such a way that the masses of Black people are kept in working class or even lower positions than that as a kind of surplus population. And so it'd be interesting, I just say this because it would be really interesting to look at different counterinsurgency tactics, right? Look at Israel, look at South Africa, look at the United States, and see the different tactics, why they were used, how they succeeded or failed in various ways.
Don't believe that there's a social order that you could kind of sit down and provide a very simple map for, where you'd have 2 or 3 components and that would function as a totality and then you'd be done with it. I think that the task of materialist analysis is one of developing the best possible cartographies of the material relations of a particular conjuncture. And that can be an analysis of a particular social order. But the way cartography functions, and for me this is how conceptual labor functions, is that if you have a perfect map, as of course Borges brilliantly described in the very short parable on the exactitude of science, where he described cartographers who would develop a map that would be the same size as the territory. That map wasted away and disappeared in the kind of distant sands because a map that is the same size as the territory is absolutely useless. It's absolutely useless because what concepts do, just like mapping does, is allow us to abstract from the infinite complexity of a given situation and provide us with a tool to apprehend that situation in such a way that we can more powerfully intervene in it. And to do that, you have to filter out certain things and make other things more prominent. That's what all strategies of mapping do. And that's what I think our conceptual process is capable of doing. And so coming along and saying that, well, your map's not perfect, is completely beside the point, because it's a map. And there's no perfect map, because a perfect map is useless. There are, though, better and worse maps. And so what I'm interested in is the best possible cartography of the given social order that we have. And I think that we do need a social cartography of modalities of exploitation, but also of oppression, and more specifically of the ways in which, and I know there's a few people who are kind of working on these types of issues, you cannot materially disarticulate the history of global capitalist exploitation from frames of oppression. Racism as a modern system emerged with the capitalist colonial system. It emerged with various forms of gendered labor, with a whole series of distribution of roles. And the idea that class would be over here, and then that all of these other things would be over here, and that they're forms of oppression, I think is quite misguided if you look at it in, again, if you have a better map. I think a really simple map is that, well, there's class determinants, and then there's things like gender oppression. Are there forms of gender oppression that aren't simply correlated to class? Yes, of course. Are there some that are fundamentally and profoundly related to how social reproduction operates, how reproduction functions, how pink-collar labor functions, the gender pay gap? Yes, absolutely. So you need a much better account of how there's kind of intertwining between these different modalities of oppression/exploitation. The project of imperial global conquest is not something that's part of the past. It's something that has ongoing iterations that often masks the ways in which the very same things are going on behind the scenes, but it's presented as if something has changed. So the very vocabulary of colonialism and neocolonialism, for instance. Of course, there are different strategies and there are different tactics that are operative, but in many ways it's the same old game. One of the things that's important is to understand exactly how colonialism operates. Colonialism is not, and I'll get into this in a moment, simply a bunch of big bad European wolves going to these other countries and rapaciously taking whatever they want. Colonialism is a very complex, dynamic, and socially striated phenomenon. And I kind of want to unpack both theoretically and practically some of what that means. But before doing that, in relationship to the dominant historical imaginary, which would situate colonialism as something in the past, I think that what we need to recognize is that if most people today will identify the civilizing mission of the 19th century, the idea that the Europeans were more advanced and they were helping these poor savages by killing them, putting them in cages, making them work for them, etc. Most people today actually do think, implicitly at some level, and of course this, you have to verify this statement, it's a grandiose statement, but I'll throw it out there for the sake of conversation and polemics, that we live in a world in which there's greater technological development, scientific advancement, and a kind of spread of a democratic consensus. And you could recognize that that spread is too slow, that it needs to be sped up, that it is variegated in its impacts, etc. But I have made the argument, and would make the argument again here, that the technico-democratic mission has simply replaced the civilizing mission. It's a contemporary logic that's a historical imaginary that allows for the perpetuation of colonial relations under different names. Today we call it democracy, before we called it the civilizing mission. Or we call it progress, development, modernization, etc. These are PR terms that are simply dressing up more or less the same old story. And of course there are variations and differences that we can get into. Again, I'm just sketching this out quickly. So I think we need a different understanding of how the dominant historical imaginary operates, and I would relate this to, and these are my kind of main claims that I'd like to put forth, a different understanding of geography. I think that in many ways, both at the level of colonialism itself and the critique of certain forms of colonialism, there is a unidimensional geography that is operative, in which it's assumed that each cultural space, and this actually overlaps with some of the things that Jennifer was saying earlier, is unified in terms of what we might want to call, by extension from the German term, a Raumgeist. And just as you say that there's a Zeitgeist, which would be the unifying spirit of the times, in many ways, a unidimensional geography presupposes a Raumgeist. What I mean by that is a spirit of a certain space, that Americans are a certain way, or this is how America is. And what that does, this culturalist geographic modeling, is it obfuscates the massive stratification and struggle that is constitutive of any spatial site. And so I think that we need to push back against this unidimensional conception of space and develop a kind of counter-geography that would actually give us theoretical and practical tools for a very different understanding, both of colonialism and its contemporary manifestations, and of the ways in which it would be, we'd be best served to struggle against colonialism. And I'll just take the biggest possible example, and that is the category of Europe. One of the things that is quite trendy today is to say things like, well, I don't read European thinkers anymore, or everything from Europe is bad, everything from elsewhere is good. And you might not even state that, but implicitly everybody kind of knows that if, someone has some type of subaltern status at the level of name recognition, that is often more important than their relationship to social stratification within a particular geographic setting and the actual agency of their politics, meaning what they're doing, like what it is that they're invested in or not invested in. And so there's a kind of culturalist reification of particular identities. And if we take the example of Europe, Europe, like all other spatial categories that we've ever inherited, is a socio-historical and cultural product. There's no such thing as Europe. In the kind of positivistic sense of the term. Can't find its borders, it's not somehow in the metaphysical realm of where we could outline what its basic essence is or something like that. Europe is a cultural concept that's been produced, reproduced, modified over time, and I'd love to share with you, because I've done a fair amount of research into the history of the codification of that category, which is related to the technico-democratic mission. Because the way in which Europe came to define itself, mainly in the 19th century, with the emergent nation states and rampant global colonialism, was that it was the source of democracy. And that democracy was invented by the Greeks, and that they were carrying this mission forward by presenting it to and sharing it with everyone else. And this continues to this day. That's a complete myth at a historical and material level. In spite of how widespread it is, the origin myth of Europe was invented in the 19th century. Go and look in the 16th century, you just don't find it. You don't find the same categories, you don't find the same reference points, you don't find the same Greco-centric conception of where Europe comes from, and you certainly don't find a praise of democracy. Democracy in the 17th century in Europe was something that was denigrated if it was used at all, with very, very few exceptions. Spinoza and the Spinoza circles make a few positive references, but for the most part, democracy meant mob rule by the ignorant masses and something to be avoided at all costs. And so, coming back to what I was saying earlier, the abstract category of Europe, what it ultimately does, if anything, is it masks the stratification operative within Europe itself. And that actually serves very explicit political purposes. Right? If you have a culturalist geography, then you erase from Europe enormous communities like the gypsies, immigrant communities, the lumpen proletariat, the working class, enormous immigrant communities, and all of a sudden they just all become Europeans. And so what's important about this culturalist geography is that it's not just intellectually, how to put it, corrupt or bankrupt. It's politically pernicious. And extremely pernicious because of the way in which it collapses that stratification into a single cultural category, and that culturalist geography serves the purpose of the powerful. Because then the people who are held accountable, when you say colonialism is the result of Europeans, it's a massive misstatement. Colonialism is the result of the elite imperial forces within certain parts of Europe and elsewhere, because of the ways in which these elite circles operate, that were oppressing people within Europe and elsewhere as well. That's how the process of colonialism operated. And so I want to highlight the importance of not thinking geography en bloc, so to speak, as just these block categories, and not culturalizing the participants within particular struggles. Because the cultural categories that we have, which is very important for this, it's a kind of emerging debate about identities and how they're constituted. The cultural identities that we've inherited due to the history of colonialism are the categories of imperialism. For the most part. There are certain examples that you could point to that are not that, but it's an enormous debate within the kind of black radical tradition in the United States. Why would you identify in certain ways within the United States when the categories, such as black, that have been given to you are the result of racial capitalism? I think that's a very important question to ask. I think it's a very difficult one to answer, because I don't think as well that there's a pure culturalist identity or racial identity that you could dig back through history and find or invent in some new way, because inevitably you inherit this particular, the inertia of these cultural framings of identity. And so I think that just as we can do a critique of Raumgeist as it applies to Europe, we also have to do the same things that applies to the rest of the world, or the West and the rest. And this comes kind of full circle to some of the things that Rivera argues for, and that is that when you simply identify someone and give them subaltern status because of their cultural identity within a particular world, it might very well be that you don't understand that world at all because of the history of how the Comprador bourgeoisie has functioned and has always functioned really within colonialism. That is that for colonialism to be really successful, it's not sufficient for a group of elite Europeans to usually hire a bunch of poor Europeans to go and kill a bunch of other people elsewhere and take all of their goods, resources, rape everyone, etc. To make that efficient at the level of cost-benefit analysis over time, you need to prop up local forms of governance. And to do that, you create stratification within the colonies, that is a reproduction of the stratification within the hegemon, and you have the local elites do your dirty work for you. In that regard, just going and saying, well, someone from a particular country is therefore aligned on, an anti-colonial struggle, or from below, or subaltern, often means actually misunderstanding the complexity of the stratification of cultural and social relations and the nature of these dynamics. And fortunately, not only Rivera, but there's a very long-standing series of radical critiques of precisely that. I'm thinking here of, John, you had brought up Malcolm X. He's a fantastic example of this. But the black radical tradition in general in the United States, from Du Bois and others up to the present, have highlighted how just because you're the member of a particular cultural category doesn't mean that you're actually aligned in the same struggle. And that what really counts is where your agency is situated, how it federates with other agencies, not the ways in which you inherit, identify with, or defend the cultural identity categories that have been constructed by the colonial machinery. In this regard, I think that it's invaluable to push back then against a certain ruling class geography. Because what better thing to do than have everybody be confused about who the real enemies are? And again, Du Bois is probably the clearest on this. The most important political lesson in many ways is to identify who your true enemies are. And Du Bois, like Fred Hampton would say it years later in the Panthers, your true enemy is not the enemy that is presented to you through the culturalist lens of the capitalist machinery. Meaning for working class white people in America, it's not the Mexican or the immigrant or the black person or whatnot, or for blacks, it's not the Mexican, etc. There are a million iterations of this. Your true enemies are the ones who are actually oppressing all of you while simultaneously dividing you with culturalist categories in order to indoctrinate you into thinking that your true identity is an identity within their culturalist apparatus, rather than an identity that you could forge yourself, working with others in struggling against those identitarian categories. And so in many ways, what I was referring to as a kind of counter-geography that pushes back against this culturalist Raumgeist, if you will, is also an appeal to recognizing the central importance of the agency that all of us have and should mobilize in relationship to the types of identities that we want to be part of, identified with, or push back against, because identities aren't just static categories that are given. They're invented, imposed, and then what you have to do is decide what you do with them. Instead of simply saying, well, I am X, in many ways, well, you're X simply because a history, usually before you were born, identified you in that way. And so there are very important questions to be raised about your autonomous relationship to the heteronymous identities that are operative within a particular social sector. You have to recognize that the third world is in the first world, and in fact, so much so that these very categories don't make much sense. And that one of the reasons that that is not readily identifiable is because of the culturalist geography and the way in which it perpetuates certain myths. So just as to take the example of the United States, you have the American dream, which is a historical or teleological account of progress that one can make. You also have the American myth, which is that the United States is a land of resources in which everyone is better off than anyone ever else, anywhere else in the world, which is just quintessentially false at so many levels. And the kind of pockmarked nature of the United States tries to establish a veil over it by which you impose a geography that homogenizes that space and renders it unidimensional so that you don't see the extreme poverty, right, and degradation in general. Which brings me to your second point, is that space for me is a site of struggle. It's not a given.
and that the nation state is one of the most powerful operators since the 19th century of the imposition of spaces. I mean, that's the project of a nation state, is to establish a homogeneous language, culture, administrative bodies in order to format a large sector of the population and destroy as much as possible, or render them liminal in kind of culture, you know, we can recognize them and give them some rights that are non-substantive. And that project has been one that is ongoing, right? So all of the vocabulary around in the 1990s, everyone was writing books on the end of the nation state, on and on and on. But of course, it wasn't the end of the nation state. I mean, the nation state it's the Coupe du Monde right now, the World Cup. And I was looking for a way to find a reference to it. But if you want nationalist ideology writ large, in which you could be a poor lumpen proletariat from Argentina, or you could be, you know, wealthy oppressor from Argentina, but nonetheless, you rally for the same team, and somehow it creates these identities where you do, or I think you should want to say, but wait a minute, just because we were born under the same nationalist ideology doesn't mean that I have anything in common with you, or want to have anything in common with you. Very quickly, I think it's a great point. One of the ways in which nationalist identity formation or subjectivation tends to operate is that you need to construct the identities that people identify with at the most visceral level. I think it's also one of the good examples of why, I mean, there's a lot of different understandings of ideology, but for me, I would prefer the vocabulary of a political imaginary just to insist on the ways in which these are affective, libidinal, they're not just representational, they're not just ideas that you have in your mind, it's the smell of your mother's house reminds you of Germany or whatever it is. All of that actually constitutes you at such a base level in your subjectivity that it takes over and is prior to rational modes of this is my identity or this is what I want to, you know, how I want to present myself. And that the formation of identity, you're absolutely right, always goes hand in hand. I'm not certain that I'd want to universalize it in relationship to like an other just in the singular. I think that it's always in relationship to a whole series of other identities, and that those identities are produced for you. And that process of kind of othering identities is part and parcel, as you're saying, of the very process of subjectivation. And so to understand identity formation, I think we have to understand that as not something that it's always already happened. You know, that's one of the brilliant things about it is subjective interpolation is always something you become aware of after the fact. And so then a real question is how you deal with it. It's not as if you walk into a room and somebody says, hey, you want some ideology? Here it is on a platter. It's you've already eaten it and it's already actually forms the organic matter of your very being. And that everything you've outlined, I think, goes hand in hand with this, for sure.